Nintendo, a company that is near and dear to the hearts of nerds everywhere. Probably the first way people are exposed to video games, at least since the year 1985. One of the most successful video game companies in history, owns tons of beloved franchises, borderline seen as the Disney of gaming. And much like Disney, Nintendo also has a reputation of being extra protective of their intellectual property, to a borderline unhealthy degree, ranging from relatively minor stuff like aggressive DMCA claims to a lot more extreme measures like actual lawsuits. Especially recently, Nintendo has gotten way worse in regards to this, and while I could make a video just crapping on them for it, I would like to try and get to the root of why this happens. But before we do that, I think it's only fair to at the very least give a couple of examples that really show the oddity surrounding this. Now for this video, I will be refraining from citing examples where Nintendo was technically in the right, such as emulators and fan games. While my stance on it is very clear, and we could probably express criticism for the fact that Nintendo uses emulators for their own games while punishing fans for doing the same, in a legal sense, Nintendo is in the right. This is for cases where Nintendo was 100% in the wrong. Like how in 2025, Nintendo tried to sue a supermarket in Costa Rica named Super Mario. Now on a first glance, you might be able to see why Nintendo would do so, but let's add some context. The store was opened in 1973, 10 years prior to the release of the first Mario game, and the name is literally just a coincidence. The man who created the store was a guy called Jose Mario Alfaro Gonzalez, and in Latin America, there's a tradition for newcomers entering the world of supermarkets to adding the prefix super to the name, in a similar vein to how in the United States, supermarkets would use the suffix mart. So quite literally, there was no relation to Mario at all. It was all purely a coincidence. And nobody noticed this until Mario's son, Charlito, was interested and expanded the store, and wanted to file the trademark in 2023. And that's when the legal battle with Nintendo ensued. Nintendo threw so many documents at them that they almost scared Charlito into submission. But he decided to press on, and it paid off because the courts sided with them, as Nintendo didn't seem to read the documents that were submitted, as while Nintendo had the full legal rights to put the Super Mario brand on video games, clothing, collectibles, toys, school supplies, nowhere did it say that they could use the name to open grocery stores. And there is an understanding that nobody is confusing one for the other. And this result is interesting as it was coming around the time of a more pressing lawsuit Nintendo is doing regarding the game Palworld. For those who do not know what Palworld is, it's a game developed by Pocket Pair that is affectionately referred to as Pokemon with Guns, where it takes a similar premise to the Pokemon franchise, but builds off of it into something different. The game being aimed at an older demographic than the Pokemon series, and, as such, takes some ideas that Pokemon fans would have wanted for a while to put into this game. An example comes from the concept of flying or gliding. In Pokemon, there is a move called Fly, which you can give to your Pokemon to be used as a way to do fast travel, but one of the desires of Pokemon fans for a long period of time was the ability to actually fly around with the Pokemon that they trained, especially when Pokemon gave us a taste of this in the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire games. But afterwards, things just went back to normalcy. In fact, it might even get worse, as you can not even really teach this move to your individual Pokemon anymore, and now they give you a designated flying or gliding Pokemon. Meanwhile, Palworld decides to improve on the mechanic by giving you this feature, an objective improvement over the currently existing mechanic. And since people are concerned that Nintendo and the Pokemon IP are getting too complacent and not living up to the levels of previous games, many people are gravitating towards them and other games to get their Pokemon fix. With this, Nintendo is now faced with two options: fix the concerns that these fans have and make better games that will earn their favor again, or remove the competition. And sadly, Nintendo has chosen the latter, launching a patent infringement lawsuit against Palworld, citing 3 specific patents on game mechanics: throwing a ball at a creature to capture it, using that creature to fight another creature, and using a bird to glide around. All 3 could be found in Palworld, before at least 2 of those features were removed from the game in order to comply with Nintendo's demands. Now, the idea that these very basic things can be patented is weird in and of itself, but you want to know when these patents were given to Nintendo? Months after Palworld came out, which is one of the main reasons this lawsuit is still being fought, as there's so much evidence of prior art that can be used to show that the concept can't be patented now, because so much art has already used all 3 of these features, with another part of the debate being about the idea versus expression distinction, where you cannot claim ownership of a vague idea, only the way it's expressed. For example, claiming ownership of the idea of capturing creatures in a ball is not applicable, but the specific expression of it in the Pokemon franchise can be, which is what the Japanese Patent Office stated when they rejected Nintendo's patent for that very concept, which puts the rest of the patents in the case into question. Another thing to do that was Nintendo rewriting one of the patents mid-suit, as their gliding patent referred to boardable creatures in reference to the gliding mechanic. But now, in Palworld, you can't glide on the birds anymore. So technically, there is no boardable creature in the game anymore. So now Nintendo's patent had to hastily add the phrase Atemo so that they can still claim that mechanics in Palworld are infringing on their patent if you look at it in a specific lens, which is not a good sign in any case. Changing the patent mid-lawsuit means that you're worried that the patent will not hold up, and adding subjectiveness to a patent infringement lawsuit is not a good sign. Nevertheless, Nintendo persists, filing patent after patent against Palworld, submitting 23 new ones in the USA alone, all but one getting tossed out. But with all that laid out in front of us again, let's finally circle back around to the question that I posed near the beginning of this video. Why? Why is Nintendo like this? Why is Nintendo one of the big 3 copyright trolls in the entertainment industry? Why? To not waste too much of your time, ultimately I think Nintendo's reasoning can be boiled down into 3 words: culture, revenge, and trauma. Now let's go bit by bit to explain what I mean by this. Culture. Japanese culture, at least since the aftermath of World War II, relies heavily on intellectual property, especially when it started becoming popular in the United States in the 60s and 70s. According to the website OEC World, the value of Japan's most valuable material export, cars, was worth 1.36 trillion yen, or roughly a little over $8 billion. Meanwhile, the anime market alone was valued at 3.84 trillion yen, or a little over $23 billion. To be clear, this is not just a Japan thing. I'm pretty sure if we ran the numbers, we would get similar results from American movies versus American material exports. It's why the world broadly has become very protective of their intellectual property rights. But for Japan specifically, their history of copyright shows they can be a little too protective, such as the time in the 1980s when the Japanese government almost sued record lending stores out of existence, as it was argued that renting was considered an alternative to buying, and it was hurting the artists by allowing people to listen to the song without buying it. but a compromise would be reached via an amendment in the Japanese Copyright Act of 1984. Around the same time, the United States was going through a similar thing when Universal tried to sue the format of home video out of existence because you could record media off a TV without the consent of the copyright holder. But that specific case had to happen so that the copyright law could be changed and things could reach something closer to a fair system. Although since we're on the topic of Universal, revenge. Because Universal gets some of the blame here directly, as in 1983, Universal tried to sue Nintendo over the character of Donkey Kong, claiming that it infringed on the character of King Kong, which they claimed ownership of. Now, the rights of King Kong were already a long-standing battle spanning all the way back to the 1930s, possibly a topic for another day, but the TLDR, Marion C. Cooper, the guy who made King Kong, was interested in making more King Kong projects, but found out while trying to make those King Kong projects, he probably did not own the rights to the character like he thought. Even more so when he saw the film's distributors, RKO Studios, licensing the character out without his permission for the upcoming King Kong vs. Godzilla movie. But while searching for proof that he owned the character, the only thing he could claim ownership of was a novelization of the original King Kong movie that came out a year before the film's release, which didn't really do much for the current debacle, but made it so that the Cooper estate had enough room to be invited to the table for future discussions. Then Universal, who distributed this film, seemed to be under the impression that they owned the American film rights to King Kong, and were planning a remake of the original film, but RKO had already given Dino De Laurentiis the okay to make a remake of his own, so Universal got into a legal battle with RKO, with the Cooper estate getting involved as well, and during the case, it was discovered that the copyright for the novel had elapsed, so the story of King Kong was technically in the public domain, so any claims that RKO had on anything that was not the 1933 duology was null and void and would revert back to the Cooper estate, who in turn sold all of the rights to Universal. I mention all this because this was really important for Nintendo's lawyer, John Kirby, who argued that per the previously mentioned case, the plot of King Kong was public domain as long as it did not infringe on the specific elements of the 1933 film. And the judge ruled that yes, at best, Nintendo borrowed things that are very loosely similar to the original story, and not of any specific interpretation of the story, and that no reasonable person would confuse Donkey Kong with King Kong, with Universal responding with a survey they conducted where it said that nobody claimed that Universal owned Donkey Kong. Which sounds like it proves them wrong, but go off, I guess. Now, with all of this in mind, put yourself in Nintendo's shoes. You almost lost one of the characters that would become one of your biggest moneymakers to someone who probably didn't have any claim in the first place. It might seem natural that you would feel a little more protective of your characters after that fact, even to the point of resorting to the tactics that were once used against you. We might see that as a little bit underhanded and maybe even hypocritical, but there is a precedent in that, because a story very similar happened in 1928, but with a very different ending, the tale of how Universal Studios stole Oswald the Lucky Rabbit from Walt Disney, who would become an even greater copyright troll than Nintendo could ever dream of, to the point of trolling the entire system to their benefit. And last, but certainly not least, trauma. Now, technically, you could call the last one trauma as well, but the reason why I'm giving this section trauma and the last section revenge is because the last section comes off more vindictive, whereas this one is actually meant to be somewhat altruistic. The same year of the Universal lawsuit, there was something else going on in the gaming sphere. A large-scale recession of the video game industry that we know today as the video game crash of 1983. Now, a lot of the people who are watching this video might not actually grasp the full understanding of how severe this was, but to give you a little bit of a clue, in 2 years, the revenue from the gaming industry dropped 97%, and it was more financially beneficial to bury 700,000 cartridges in the New Mexico desert than it was to actually put them to market. The consensus at the time period was that the video game industry was going to be a passing fad due to the massive shift on how the market went. Now, what caused this shift, you may ask? The biggest factor blamed was the oversaturation of the video game market with subpar games that didn't live up to the demands of the consumers. The video game crash would end in 1985 with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, thus making Nintendo the savior of gaming, right after beating one of the largest movie companies in the world. Not only would this obviously be a massive ego boost, but we all also need to take a little bit of time to analyze the video game scene of the Atari era. It was literally the Wild West. Since the video game market kind of really took off in this time period, we had no idea what you could and could not do, and as such, a lot of stuff just happened. Like, if you knew how to program an Atari game and found any electronic company willing to sell it, it would end up on the shelf right next to in-house Atari games. Which is how you would be able to get games about raping Native Americans selling next to Atari space shooters. And intellectual property law really didn't seem to be that big of an issue, with Coleco literally releasing an add-on to their console, the ColecoVision, that allowed you to play Atari 2600 games on it, alongside selling their own Atari 2600. The fact that that made it to the store shelves is insane. And while all this was going on, Nintendo was there, watching and learning. And maybe they took a lesson from all that. Stricter control. Most games made by Nintendo, both past and present, are first-party games, and the ones that aren't need to work really hard to get that Nintendo seal of approval. Nintendo even took direct lessons from that time period that they still follow to this day. Since Atari didn't have a way to prevent unlicensed games from being played on the 2600, Nintendo would implement a feature to prevent that, even getting into a lawsuit with Atari, who reverse-engineered the lockout chip so that they could make NES games without Nintendo's permission, with many other companies figuring out a way to circumvent the lockout chip. And again, while this is technically the most altruistic and admirable reason Nintendo has to be protective of their IP, I would like to mention one thing that puts what happened in a different light. While it's definitely more than just this, there was one game that was considered the largest factor of the video game crash happening: E.T. for the Atari 2600, one of the biggest commercial failures in gaming, and widely regarded as one of the worst games of all time. It was produced in-house by the Atari team under a strict licensing agreement. Clearly, that didn't seem to be the problem, and even if the problem was an extreme, is the solution to solving it another extreme? Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you see more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.